So good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. So before we get going, I want to say thank you for tuning into this podcast. I say this every week, but I mean it. It means so much to me because I bring to you on a weekly basis great people who are writers, who are authors, who love children, who are doing their best to steer kids and their families in the right direction. And today is no exception. I have a wonderful guest I'm going to introduce in 1 minute. But if you like what you hear, I ask that you pass it on to your friends, your family. We are building an audience for the people who come on my show. I want them to be heard, and that's why I am so ardent, and I keep on repeating this on a weekly basis. So, that being said, it's a pleasure to introduce to the Hamilton Review today Jessica Lahey. She is an author, an educator, a speaker. She has been an English, Latin, and writing teacher in middle and high school for over a decade. She writes a biweekly parent-teacher conference advice column for the New York Times. She's a contributing writer at The Atlantic. She has appeared as a commentator on Vermont Public Radio. She earned a JD degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and has been concentrating on juvenile and education law. Jessica Lahey, it's such a pleasure to welcome you today to the Hamilton Review.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're an accomplished woman, and you also have good common sense. So we're going to talk about a book that Jessica wrote called The Gift of Failure. The subtitle is How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go so their children can succeed. We're going to get to that book in a minute, but before we do, Jessica, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you and have you maybe share a little bit about you as a person, your life, where you grew up, a little bit about your background, and why it is that you're doing what you're doing today. So, Jessica Lahey, you're on.
I love that question. I get asked a lot about my parents because people figure it gives some insight into how I parent. And I think the overarching thing that I loved so much about the way I was raised is that my parents trusted me to make good decisions. And, they were there to, guide me and support me and correct me as if I made bad decisions. But they had this just overarching belief that I was going to go into the world and make good decisions. And that trust, that's everything to me. That's been everything to me. And on the other hand, and just to speak a little bit to my second book about substance use prevention. So I was also raised in a family with an alcoholic. And those two things have been really instrumental in where I've gone with my work. I have the coolest job in the world, which, first of all, as a teacher, I taught for 20 years total and absolutely loved it. Taught every grade from sixth grade to 12th grade. Loved it, loved it, loved it. And then had the opportunity to do the thing that had been my dream my entire life, which was to become an author as well. And this book, The Gift of Failure, really came out of what I was seeing in my middle school classroom, what I was seeing the parents of my middle school students do, this sort of end run around learning opportunities. The kids would make mistakes and then there'd be no consequences, or the kids would, there'd be a learning opportunity based on a mistake they made. And then that learning opportunity would be taken away from them because the parents would solve the situation for them. And I was really curious what that does to motivation, learning, engagement. And so I got to spend, as I mentioned, coolest job in the world. I got to get curious about this thing, spend a couple of years researching it, and then write about what I found. And same thing with my second book, The Addiction Inoculation. I wanted to understand. I'm an alcoholic. I've been in recovery for 11 and a half years. But when I got sober, immediately my brain went to, oh my gosh, I was raised by an alcoholic. One of my parents was raised by an alcoholic, and so on and so on and so on. And so what should my parenting best practices be, and education best practices? What role do schools play in substance use prevention? Again, I got sold that book and got to go into my hidey hole here in Vermont and research and research and research, and then come back out with what I found. And it's been, and then I get to go out on the road speaking and sort of explaining that stuff to parents and educators, and it's the best job in the whole world. I'm so grateful that I get to do this work.
Well, you do good work, and you really obviously you take your what you do seriously. You have a lot of notes in the back here, and it's very clear that you didn't just sit down and start writing one day because writing a book, it takes a lot of time. I wrote one book, so you're ahead of me by one, and I can tell you
Actually,
that it took.
just to interject to the for my second book, The Addiction Inoculation, it took me a full year of research from the time I figured out what I was going to be writing about to writing the proposal. And the proposal process, for me anyway, takes a good couple months at least to sort of hammer out what it's going to be. So by the time I start writing a book, I've already been in research mode for a couple of years. And I love that mode. I
Yeah.
love the research. I absolutely love it. And so, it was really fun. Actually, I got an award for the addiction inoculation from the Research Society on America. And what was so cool about that is it was the scientists saying, you got the research right, and yay. So for me, that's like the best possible award I could have gotten. Like National Book Award, that's great, but an award from the scientists saying I got the science right, that to me is a huge win.
That's amazing because so many people who are not necessarily scientists look at information and are not able to interpret it in a correct way.
Right.
Also when you read, write a book, you have to think about every word you're saying, and also you have to make sure the veracity of it. If you say something stupid, it's really hard to retract things because
Yeah,
you're
absolutely.
just, if nothing else, is pretty embarrassing. So you wrote this book. Again, I'm going to talk about. By the way, we're going to talk about both books today, friends. We're going to get to the Addiction Inoculation, which is a more recent book that Jessica has written. But her first book was called The Gift of Failure. And first of all, just the title of that book caught my eye, and I thought, okay, how can failure be a gift? That seems so counterintuitive. I mean, most people don't want to fail. Yet I think that we all realize, everybody listening to me on this podcast today realizes that there are things that we have done in our life where we have failed. We have flat out failed. We did not accomplish what we set out to accomplish, and in fact, we fell on our back, and we it was pretty miserable. So first of all, maybe we'll start with our conversation by maybe having you explain the title of your book.
So, as I mentioned, when I was writing that book, I was a middle school teacher, and middle school is the most amazing, most wonderful proving ground for, for kids who don't have, as your listeners may or may not know, the brain develops from the bottom up, and the bottom of the brain is the great reacting part of the brain. It's really good at like emotional stuff and reacting to stimulus and reacting to that kid who makes us mad because you just want to punch them. But the upper part of the brain is the adulting part of the brain, right? It does all of the like task management, resource management, and impulse control, and all that kind of stuff happens in the upper part of the brain. But middle school kids don't have that part of the brain wired up yet. So there, we ask them to do more than they could ever possibly handle. And then, as middle school teachers, the fun of it is we're just watching them make mistake after mistake after mistake, and then finding the right learning moment to help them learn from that mistake and to truly believe us when we say, sweetie, it's okay that you failed at this thing. What I care about is that you learned from this experience. And increasingly, what I was seeing is middle school became this place where no, 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 the stakes are too high, failures aren't acceptable, blah, blah, blah. And, that just, it's counterintuitive as a middle school teacher, as someone whose job is to watch kids make mistakes and to help them, problem solve their way out of them or to do better next time. The idea that we're taking away all of those opportunities for kids is maddening.
There are kids out there. I have two comments. First of all, there are kids out there who don't seem to make mistakes. They're smart. They also have I don't know what it is, but I remember kids in my middle year schools who seem to have it more together. Um, is that a bad sign to you? Are you concerned about the kids who are too together and don't seem to be making all the errors that other people make?
It's funny you say that. It absolutely depends on the kid. I there are some kids who come into middle school just really with their cognitively they have developed more of their connected more of their upper brain than some other kids have, and I really like to make it clear to parents that has nothing to do with intelligence. That has to do with cognitive development. Like no matter how many times I explain symbolism and metaphor to a middle school student, sometimes they're for a period of time they don't have the capacity to understand metaphor. And it's not like they're not smart, and it's not that I haven't introduced them to it enough times. It's just they can't do that yet. And then there's that magical day when those neurons connect and suddenly that part of the brain is available to them and they can understand this concept they didn't understand before. And that's the magic of teaching. I mean, that's why you show up every day in the classroom. There are kids, however, that I'm often worried about, which are the kids who are afraid to take chances, the kids who don't take the challenge problems because they're worried that they'll get stuff wrong and that'll mar my or their understanding of themselves. There are
Yeah.
kids who choose not to ask for help because that's too threatening. Kids who won't raise their hand and admit they need help with something or they don't understand something. Everyone's on a different developmental level, but there are the really sort of perfectionist slash anxious slash um, kids who also feel it's really important to not show how hard they're working, that they need to like put their head down, make it look effortless. And I think that's really been the thing that's contributing to a lot of anxiety in kids and a lot to, the rates we see of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation that we see among adolescents and young adults. And I really worry about those kids. I was one of those kids, and I really, really worry about them as the oldest and as someone who felt a huge responsibility to do well at everything. I was scared to death of things that I didn't do well at, and I stayed away from them, didn't want to touch them with a 10-foot pole because I needed everyone to believe and I needed myself to have evidence to believe that I was just really good at things. And so I stuck to the things I was good at and avoided the things that I wasn't good at. And unfortunately, I was hindering my own cognitive development by doing that. So I do worry
Sure.
about kids like me.
I mean, I think that when you're in middle school, and definitely listen, this continues through high school and adulthood too, as well. But you don't want to expose your vulnerabilities. And I think that sometimes when you raise your hand and ask a question, people realize that you're not understanding something that maybe they do. And I think that we all kind of fear that sense of being mocked. Mocking is something that, hate to say it, but I don't care how many people say don't bully, don't bully. I see these signs on the schools. We don't believe in bullying and everything. It goes on, and we know that that's kind of the nature of kids. They do kind of bully each other, or they kind of snicker, and we know that that is a. I think we've all been snickered at once or twice in our life, and that is a painful thing, right? And so we all avoid these things. I think that's human nature in a big way. Going back to your title again, the gift of failure. I will tell you that that is a tough sell in Los Angeles. Is a tough sell to my patients. And you've been speaking as an educator, but as a parent, you're watching your child, you're watching your kid, and something's not working. They went out and something didn't happen, or they fell into they failed a course, or they lost the game. Talk to us a little bit about from the perspective of a parent.
Yeah. Well, first of all, in just understand that everything I write and everything I talk about comes from mistakes that I've also made as well. I have been really emotionally involved in my kids', for example, academic achievement. My husband and I are both like a little too educated, spent a little bit too much time in the classroom. We really, really believe in evidence and all that sort of stuff. And so, academic achievement means a lot to us. And that's it's been difficult to take my hopes and dreams and my wishes for what my children are going to become and my understanding of who my children are out from the equation of what they want, who they really are. And that can be really hard for us. And as parents, the other issue is that we don't want our kids to be frustrated, to feel stupid, to struggling with those feelings of discomfort. And the problem is that's when we tend to step in and take over for them or do for them because we don't like to see them uncomfortable. And that is really, again, robbing them from a lot of learning experiences. And I need my kids to believe me when I say things like, sweetie, it's really okay that this didn't go the way you planned. What I care about most is that you learn from it. And kids don't believe us when we say that right now. And I get to talk to a lot of kids every year. And they tell me that what they really believe is that their parents want them to be perfect, to get everything right, to get all the A's, and that the mistakes are just not acceptable. But we have to model that for them. We have to show them that that's what we really mean. And the ways we do that are by focusing more on the process of learning and less on the end product. And not just of learning, of becoming, becoming a better soccer player, becoming a better piano player, becoming a better human being. We're going to make mistakes around the way we treat other people or the way we approach problems. And what I need for them to know is that I really am focused on this process of learning, less on this one snapshot, this one thing they did that may not have gone as planned. And so that's kind of like this constant mantra I have to keep going because I want them to get it right. I want them not to be hurt. I want them to feel smart and accomplished and competent. But they can only feel competent, which, by the way, is not the same as confidence. Competence is confidence based on actual skill building and experience. I need for them to feel confident, competent, and I also need for them to feel this thing called self-efficacy. And the idea behind self-efficacy is that if you have a strong sense of self-efficacy, you feel like this situation is not what I want, and if I take action, I can change this situation. And it's the kids who have been heavily overparented, like all the choices have been taken away from them. They don't feel like they have a lot of control in their lives, or kids who have had no parenting, kids who have been in, for example, group homes, foster care, where no matter what they do, their future is not determined by them. It's determined by outside forces. And I've taught both of those kids in the drug and alcohol rehab where I worked for 5 years. And that low level of self-efficacy leads to all kinds of things like substance use, like not wanting to commit to goals in the future because why bother? The no matter what action I take, I can't change the future. Um, that's highly worrisome, highly high risk for substance use. Something that, I really want parents to understand is one of the most important things they can give their kids is this feeling of self-efficacy.
So, okay, I want to back up a little bit, and I
Mhm.
want to talk about your first chapter. You said how failure became a dirty word, a brief history of American parenting. So let's turn the time back a little bit because what you're saying here is that, hey, it hasn't always been the way it is today. So can you give us maybe a snapshot view of what American parenting was maybe 100 years, 200 years ago? You can start where you want to start.
Sure, I'd love to avoid the rosy lens of nostalgia that we tend to use a lot to say, "Oh, if only," or "It was better when I was little." We have a selective memory about these sorts of things. Some aspects of being a kid now are much better. Kids now have, the language to express, emotions and their needs and that sort of stuff better. But okay, avoiding that. Essentially, we are having kids later. We're having fewer kids. We're having kids after having been in the workforce for longer or in education for longer. And we tend to use those tools, the ones we gathered in education or the workforce, like spreadsheets, for example, as tools for our parenting. We also,
Right.
if you're me anyway, and this is speaking to, my situation is I had my first kid after having gone to graduate school and having been in the workforce for a long time. I was used to grades. I was used to my evaluations on my work. And save for like growth charts, I didn't get that feedback on my parenting. Like, and as if that growth chart was feedback on my parenting, it was not really. But I needed grades for my parenting, and the only place that I had to look was to my kid. And that is so unfair of us to turn our children into um, some sort of evaluation of our parenting skills. And it leads to all kinds of unintended consequences around our parenting, where we're parenting for what we want our kid to be or what we wish our kid to be, instead of parenting the kid we actually have. And that's a problem. Kids who don't feel heard, seen, known, loved for who they are tend to suffer from more mental health consequences, and are at higher risk for substance use and all that kind of other stuff. So, while there are, having fewer kids and heaping more importance on each kid, and we're in an economic place right now where it's really difficult to make a go of it, at 18, walking out the door trying to get a job and support, a family. That would be, it's near impossible. But given all of that, we have, as a society anyway, that pendulum has swung way over in the direction of being on top of every single decision our kids make, and monitoring them through their phones, using Life 365, using Find My iPhone, watching where they drive. Kids tell me all kinds of crazy stories about how much monitoring is on top of them, reading their emails, reading their texts, all that kind of stuff. And what we know is that kids who are more heavily controlled by their parents lie to their parents more, and kids who have more authoritarian parenting, who are authoritarian parents, who have very high expectations for their kids, but also not very high sort of sense of warmth and empathy. Those kids tend to use substances more. Those kids tend to have higher sort of issues with mental health, negative mental health outcomes. Whereas parents who are authoritative, who have very high expectations for their kids, but also high levels of warmth and support, those kids just seem to do better and have better mental health outcomes.
So you mentioned the term overparenting. I think you've already defined that. Is where
It's
they
which is
they're
not
you're
even a
watching.
term, which is not even a term that I love, by the way. It's just one that's sort of out there. I prefer the term directive, overly directive parenting, which is just sort of telling kids like what to do exactly when and how and all that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. But overparenting is kind of a loose term that's just kind of out there and accepted. So
No, I see it in my practice, and I
yeah.
try to avoid over. I tell people, listen, I want kids, and you want this too. You want kids to be well-rounded. You want them to be involved with sports. You want them to be doing music and theater and all the different opportunities which are amazing in today's world. At the same time, you don't want to have them so scheduled that every minute of their time is like this. Is like regimented to the point where they're not kids. They can't enjoy just hanging out and not feeling that pressure of having to be somewhere and do something at any given time. And I'm sure that's part of the challenge that all of us as parents try to do. You have any thoughts about that? I mean, just if
Well, yeah,
free
I
time
mean,
for
I
kids, is
no,
that
I think
yeah,
it's an individual problem, but it's also a collective parenting problem because, as someone I raised my kids in a rural environment, and they were very much forced out the door and said, go outside, don't come back inside for a while, go do kid things outside. But the problem, go play with other kids. And we were fortunate enough that there were other kids in the neighborhood that they could play with who weren't scheduled to the gills, because a lot of parents would say, well, great, I'll take my kids out of some activities and tell them to go outside and play with other kids, and there are no other kids to play with because all of those other
yeah.
kids are overscheduled. So, I want to take that. I don't want to shame parents for, individually, for not giving their kids enough time to play and all that sort of stuff, because to a degree this needs to be a problem that we push back on collectively. We can be each other's worst enemy when it comes to sort of being really hyper focused on our own parenting, and hyper focused on our own kids. So it's a really difficult position to be in, because you want to do that. You want to give your kids more time, and yet, kick the can isn't really a thing that's happening because, there's no one out there to play it with.
No, I mean, I think that, America in particular, certainly the last 50 years of America, the neighborhoods, when you tell your kid to go outside and play, by play. Well, I know what that meant when I was a kid. My mother would say, leave, get outside. And I had friends to play with. They were all out there playing in the streets, and we played, we had wonderful times. If you say that in my community, you walk outside, there's nobody out there. I mean,
Right.
in our neighborhood, there aren't that many kids. I hate to say it. And our little individual little houses can also be kind of far away from each other. So you can't necessarily just run next door and knock on the door. You have to go, a half a mile, a quarter mile before you find someone your age who you can interact with. But it is I do think that free time for kids is really, really encouraging to them, and it helps to build their self-confidence and everything else. There is a thing called the travel team trap. Have you heard about that?
Absolutely. Yep.
Travel team trap. I can't say it, but anyway, I do sometimes wonder about that phenomenon, and I am gently encouraging my children who now have children to avoid that one. Do you have any thoughts about the travel team trap?
There are no absolutes here. As the mom of two kids who I had one athlete and one non-athlete, and there were also certain sports that I said from a parenting perspective that I just wasn't willing to get involved in because of the time obligations and all that sort of stuff. But I also have, and I'm glad I did it that way. And I'm glad my kids went the way they did in terms of, they weren't a part of these big traveling leagues. On the other hand, I have a niece who is now in college playing sports in college on, she's in the big time. This is the dream for so many parents. And believe me, she's worked so hard, and sports saved her life, particularly during COVID. And
Yeah.
so there's a cost benefit analysis to be weighed. I have a friend whose kids are very involved in sports, and when that kid wanted to take on a third sport in high school, the mom did this really smart thing. She sat down with him and she said, let's make a list of the things that are really important to you in terms of how you spend your time. And let's look at, if you join this other sport, what you won't have time to do. And after talking all of that stuff through, the kid decided, oh, especially during this season, it was spring, especially during this season, these things over here, spending time with my friends and, getting to do some of this other stuff is important enough to me that I guess I'm not going to add that third sport. So there's a cost benefit analysis to be paid here. There's also a wonderful book by someone named Kirsten Jones called Raising Empowered Athletes. And she is all in with sports. She was a NCAA Hall of Fame athlete. She's raising athletes. And she says some of the same things. This is all a part of a big cost benefit analysis in terms of what your priorities are as parents. Parents ask me all the time, one of the biggest questions I get is, can I let my kid quit this thing? And whatever that thing is, piano, soccer, whatever. And I say that really comes down to your family's priorities. So in our family, for example, piano was causing such a schism between myself and my kid over practicing. And in our family, we don't happen to be highly dedicated musicians. Music is great. I love music, but it was not important enough in our family to create relationship problems between us and our kid. And so we got rid of the piano. So again, this comes down to really individual decisions. But I feel bad for a lot of kids who are on some teams and who are committed to any one thing too much. We've heard from physicians about stress injuries they're suddenly seeing in young kids
Sure.
that they didn't used to see before. We're seeing about, the stress levels that some kids have when it comes to they're moving towards a goal of playing in college, which for the most part isn't going to happen with most kids. We also see in the gift of failure specifically, I talked to a coach, a guy who works with really serious athletes, and he asked them what was their favorite thing about youth sports and their least favorite thing about youth sports. And they said their least favorite thing about youth sports was the ride home with their parents after the big game. And let's think about the kind of conversations that happen in cars that are so important to our communication with our kids. And that makes me so sad. And their favorite part of youth sports, by the way, was when their grandparents came to watch them play, because most grandparents are there because they get great joy out of watching their kids play, their grandkids play, not because of how many minutes they play or how many goals they scored, that kind of thing. So I always tell parents to be a little bit more like the grandparents instead of the parents.
That's right. I think that that kind of segues into your chapter, encouraged from the sidelines. And I think that grandparent, like I happen to go to a lot of athletic events because I have 13 grandchildren, and I'm getting a lot of invitations to go to a lot of different games, and I guess that I don't have the emotional wherewithal to get psyched up and completely overwhelmed on who wins. I just don't. I mean, I'm a very different person than I was maybe several years ago, when I really wanted, definitely when my kids were playing, I could hardly even watch the games. I was so anxious sometimes. But anyway, I remember when my daughters would play volleyball, I couldn't sit. I had to like walk around, and people thought I
Hmm.
was crazy, but I just was so anxious. But as a grandparent, I can tell you that I can watch a game pretty comfortably. I kind of go, good job, and my level is intensity is not quite as high, and I can appreciate my grandchild for what they're, just the fact they're on the team. So
I have a
can
hack
you
actually
say
for some, I have a hack for some parents. I would get really worked up at my son's cross country meets,
yes?
and so I became a sort of a de facto team photographer, and I would jog to various spots on the course where I could get the best pictures, and then I would upload them to Google Drive, and then my son could share them with all of his friends. And it was a way of giving back to the team, and it was a way of occupying myself with something other than wringing my hands. And it got me away from some of the other parents who could be really stressed out, because I was
Yes.
running from spot to spot on the course. It gave me something else to do, which was great for me.
Well, I would have been out there walking around stressed with you. You were taking pictures. I would have still been annoying you. You talk about, and I want to say, I'm watching our time here. I do want to talk about one more issue in terms of this gift of failure, because I want to talk about your other book, the Addiction Inoculation. But you mentioned household chores. Um, is this something that people are no longer doing? Is this a new? I mean, I think that when I was a kid, I had certain chores I had to do, and you're shaking your head. I think you probably did too. Tell us a little bit about why household chores are important.
First off, I don't call them chores, mainly because a chore is not something I want to do. I don't know about you, but that sounds awful. Chore has this negative connotation. I call them household duties because they're part of what we do as being part of a family. Is research that shows that kids who have an active role in keeping a family together and moving forward and functioning suffer fewer negative mental health issues when something does happen that's negative in the family, like a death of a parent or illness or divorce or separation or whatever. It's also the reason that I never paid my kids for doing stuff around the house, because I give kids, and there's a wonderful book on this, by the way, by Ron Lieber, the Your Money columnist at the New York Times, called The Opposite of Spoiled. I don't pay my kids for doing things around the house, because that's what we do as part of a family. That's what a family does to keep the house running and moving forward.
Yeah.
I pay my kids money to help them learn how to deal with money and to have an allowance and to budget and save and spend and all that sort of stuff. And Ron Lieber covers that beautifully. But we do, kids, I need help and my husband needs help. And our kids are not free riders in our home. They help keep the house together. And um, it really pays off in the long run if you get over the hard part of teaching them how to do those things and getting them used to doing them without being asked. But it is possible. And there's great advice, not just in Gift of Failure, but there's another book called How to Be a Happier Parent that I love, where The author of this book, KJ Dell'Antonia, she's actually a friend of mine. She and my podcast co-host, actually, she surveyed about 1,000 parents and asked them what was their least favorite part of parenting. And these 6 things kept coming back. And one of them was household duties. And she found out what works and what doesn't work in terms of getting kids habituated to doing things around the home. And I highly recommend that book around habit formation and stuff like that. But yeah, I did a lot of duties when I was growing up, and it was expected that I would do them. And some of them I loathed. I hated raking leaves. We lived in the pretty much in the woods. Raking leaves to me was a horrific, horrible duty, but we had to do it because it was the yard that we played in, and it was where our garden was, and we wanted the grass to survive. And it's just part of my job as a kid. Still hate it.
Probably you are partly who you are today because you raked leaves. I'm of the opposite. I love to rake leaves. I don't know. I mean, I grew up in California, so we don't have the kind of the foliage that you guys have. We have more evergreen trees out here, but when I get to rake leaves, this is a contemplative time for me.
Well, I have
All
to
right.
say, now that I'm a gardener, my thinking on this has changed, and I mulch my leaves and I put them all over my gardens, and I love doing it. It's great, but that's because I have a higher purpose for what I'm doing, as opposed to just standing there when I could be like playing with my friends or whatever. There seemed to
Exactly.
be no purpose to me as a 13-year-old raking
Yeah.
the leaves at home.
So I want to save a little bit of time for your newest book, which is called The Addiction Inoculation. And I think this is pretty, the name is explanatory. But tell us why you wrote the book, because this to me is fascinating. And by the way, very timely as well.
Thank you. So as I mentioned, I got sober in 2013, June 7th, 2013, mainly because my dad was brave enough to tell me that I needed help. And I'm still very, very grateful to him for that. He recognized that I needed help, and I did, and I got into recovery. But as I mentioned, there is substance use disorder all over my family tree. And I was looking at it, and even knowing all of that, I still went down that path. So what what are the best practices for raising kids, especially kids who have a genetic predisposition for substance use disorder? That was the big question mark I had. And I also was teaching at a drug and alcohol rehab for adolescents, and I wanted to know what education could have done differently for these kids to keep them away from the situation they're in. What could have saved them? What could have prevented this? So that led me to try to figure out, from a parenting and education perspective, what are best practices around substance use prevention, what's true, what's myth. There are a lot of things we do because we cross our fingers hoping that those things will work. Like, a lot of parents give their kids sips at home, hoping that that will help them somehow become a moderate drinker, or help them not be so freaked out when suddenly they're in front of a keg and have all the access they want. That's a myth. It actually increases our children's risk of developing substance use disorder over their lifetime. But I had made all these mistakes. When I wrote this book, my oldest was in his late teens, and my youngest, my daughter, was, somewhere around like 10. And I changed what I'd done between those two kids and explained to my daughter very specifically why I changed what I did and what the evidence is. And that has led to a situation where, she sort of chuckles and laughs when I'm like, no, you can't have a sip of this because your brain's not developing yet. And she actually only has 16 more days until she is of legal age. So she can, what she does after her birthday is sort of more up to her. But we're going to continue to have conversations about, even though she's 21, her brain is not done developing yet. She does have still a lot of connections to make in there, and a lot of things that can go awry, because drinking and using substances, addictive substances, during adolescence is far more dangerous than using addictive substances once brains are fully completed, and that's early to mid 20s. So that was another example of, I didn't know how to move forward as a parent and as an educator, and so thankfully I was given the time and space and finances to be able to do that research and then translate that research for other parents and educators.
So your point about the when youth begin to abuse drugs and alcohol is really tough to reel it back, and that's one of the major reasons why I am so concerned about the cannabis and the fact that they're in all
Mhm.
throughout the entire country. Cannabis is becoming much more of a very, very readily available. Certainly in California, it's extremely readily available, and the effect it has on kids, obviously alcohol and other drugs as well. But cannabis has been kind of the breakthrough substance in the last decade or so that it seems to be really ubiquitous here in California, that's for sure. So what are some of the things that you can do to inoculate kids from heading in this direction?
So, first of all, we know scared straight doesn't work. We know just say no doesn't work. We know the because I said so doesn't work. What works is the why behind the reasoning. We know that the younger a kid is when they first try addictive substances, the higher their lifelong chances of developing substance use disorder. There's some statistical confounders in there,
Mm.
but
Yep.
essentially, we know that um, if a kid is in eighth grade when they first try substances, their lifelong risk is somewhere around 50% of developing substance use disorder. If it's in 10th grade, drops by about half to around 21%. And if they are 18, it drops by another half down to 10 or 11%. And again, confounders, availability, all that kind of thing. But that's what we know. We know that parents who have a consistent and clear message of no, not until your brain is done developing, because it's my job as your parent to preserve your brain and allow it to develop unimpeded. Those parents have kids with much lower rates of substance use and then substance use disorder if that's out there. We know that genetic predisposition is about 50 to 60% of the risk picture. That comes from Dr. Mark Schuckett. And that for parents of kids who do have that elevated genetic predisposition, it's especially urgent that we're talking to kids about their brain development, helping them understand that these substances work differently in the adolescent brain than they do in a fully adult brain. Alcohol, for example, there's very different ways it is managed and the way we perceive it in the adolescent brain without going into too much detail. Understanding that what we're trying to do is to protect their brains, protect their health, that let me see what else, that we have this understanding that if you can get past this period of incredibly plastic brains, this adolescent period, and then they make it to adulthood with their brains mostly intact, that the decisions they make as adults, that's going to be up to them. But here's what's going on with our family, with your brain, and why I'm working so hard to help you make good decisions, and then helping them, giving them refusal skills, or we're using inoculation theory to give them the ability to say, to give responses in a safe sort of space, whether that's rehearsing responses, whether that's having a vocabulary of responses. There's 2.5 pages in the Addiction Inoculation of excuses that adolescents gave me for things that they could say if they were at a party and someone offered them drugs or alcohol and they didn't want to use them. Really inventive stuff. I said, give me suggestions that you could use that would help you not lose face, while understanding that no is a complete sentence. um, there are lots of ways that we can approach this, but attempting to get them to just say no, to scaring them to death about this stuff is not the right way to go. And attempting to create a moderate drinker, or the alternative that I hear a lot is, well, they're going to do it anyway, I may as well let them do it at our house, and I'll take the keys away and I'll keep them safe. Not only are you raising your own kids' risk for substance use disorder, you're raising their peer cohort's risk for substance use
Yeah.
disorder as
Yeah.
well. Peer
That's right.
cohort is a massive part of this picture, which is why I'm so grateful to this kid, Brian, who was the focus of the peer cohort chapter. Um, a friend of my son's who did have issues with substances and lent his story to the book to help me get a better grasp on sort of how friends and peer group affects our own kids, and can actually be a boon as well as a the bane of a parent's existence.
I remember so well when I was a kid growing up, cannabis and I mean, just drugs in general were becoming very, very prevalent in my community in Northern California. And I remember going to parties, and so many of my friends were drunk or they were loaded on something bad, LSD or speed or whatever it was, and I didn't do it. And I think I was afraid to do it a little bit. I also did have I had parents who were very clear about not doing it. They didn't tell me the why. They didn't really know. I mean, when you give me these numbers, this terrifies me. 50% in eighth grade, 21% at 15 years of age, 10% at 18 years of age that you become addicted, lifetime addiction. Those are huge numbers, especially when you're talking about, 50% in eighth grade. Because when I was in eighth grade, I knew kids who were definitely going out and getting it. I think it's the big challenge is that you're talking about these middle school years, Jessica, where these are years where your frontal cortex is not formed. And man, I look at this and the pressure to want to be cool, the pressure to want to be part of that in group, and if that in group is doing something very, like going out and having parties and all the things that we're talking about, it's really hard to say no. It really
Well,
is, and
let's take the example of that eighth grader for a second. One important
yeah,
information piece of information for eighth graders is if your eighth grader, let's say, is at a party, gets offered something, and they get this, and let's say they say no, and someone comes back and says, "Well, it's no big deal. Everybody's doing it." The truth is that's just not true. Only 24.7% of eighth graders report that they've had more than a sip of alcohol by the end of eighth grade. And I'm not saying your kid needs to know 24.7, but what they can know is that everybody's doing it is absolutely positively not true. It is the vast minority of kids. And even going all the way up to college, I almost didn't write the college chapter for the addiction inoculation because my frame of reference is Animal House. Why? Of course, everyone in
yeah.
college drinks. That's not true either. In fact, it's highly predictable who will be a binge drinker in college and who won't. Give me like answers to 10 questions and I can give you, some sort of risk factor there. But when you look at the alcohol that's consumed on college campuses, it's 72% of the alcohol that is consumed on college campuses is consumed by the heaviest binge drinkers. And looking at who drinks in college and why they drink in college and figuring out risk behaviors and all that sort of stuff and what kids are involved in and where they live on campus, all of these pieces of information are really important. So for example, if we know that it's kids who live in Greek, in the most Greek society, most Greek houses are the ones who drink the most, and your kid says they want to live in the Greek system, you can talk to them about it and say, sweetie, I'm really interested in this, your decision to rush a fraternity or sorority. What is it you're hoping to get out of that? And there are lots of benefits to being in the Greek system. There are also risk factors that they kind of need to know about to make a decision around why they're choosing to live where they live. Kids who live in the Greek system, kids who are heavily involved in college sports, not just as participants, but as spectators. There are certain sports that have higher rates of use than other ones, namely high contact sports, lacrosse, wrestling, football, and there's one more that's not coming to mind right now, but those are the highest contact sports. Those are also the sports with the highest levels of substance use among players and spectators. So having these conversations and knowing what the risk factors are, knowing what your kids' individual risk factors are, so that you can apply prevention to the areas that make the most sense for your kid, requires us to be a little bit objective about our kids, which is hard. It's really, really
Hard to do.
hard.
So I do, you mentioned that it's scaring them, it doesn't work. I have been using a little bit of scare techniques here in California because of this fentanyl thing, which does
Okay,
scares
so
me personally.
you're getting at the one place where I'm perfectly fine with a little bit of fear. I am so against fear mongering when it comes to most aspects of parenting. This is
Yeah,
the one area where I am 100% all in with scaring the bejesus out of kids who are buying drugs online, who are willing to trust someone then when they say what a pill is. It's
yeah.
just too dangerous. It is just too dangerous. My nieces have lost friends. I've lost friends, kids. It's too dangerous right now with fentanyl in the system.
And fentanyl is really out there. I mean, I have I've lost a couple of patients, and I mean, these are sad. I mean, and these are not kids who necessarily wanted to overdose. It wasn't like this is a suicidal type
Right,
of thing
right.
at all. It was completely that they were basically their lives were taken from them, put it that
Mhm.
way.
That's why
And
we use the
by
term poisoning as opposed to overdose.
yeah,
If you're taking drugs and you believe that what you're taking is a bar of Xanax and it's got fentanyl in it, you are being poisoned. You
sure.
were unknowingly taking the fentanyl.
Exactly, exactly. So I do kind of go to that with my teenagers when I talk to teenagers, and I talk to them about drinking. I talk to them about these issues and ask what's going on out there. You're absolutely right that the majority of my kids in general are not binging every weekend. That's for darn sure. That's my teenagers, they're not. And the number you say 24% of kids who are eighth grade have tasted alcohol. That means the vast majority, I mean, 75% have not.
Yeah,
So
the term
you're,
is more than a sip because there's this we it's just the way the research is done is the
yeah,
question is more than a sip with the assumption, unfortunately, that some kids are going to have sips. But yeah, more than a sip, meaning like you've had a drink, you've had, anyway,
yeah.
that's just the way the research works.
And as your kids age, then you look at them and say, "Is your life?" Is that how
Yeah.
you do it? Yeah,
I look at my kids and I talk to them about their goals. And, I know for a fact that, my oldest had very specific career goals that require his short term memory to be working really well. And he lives in New
yeah,
York City where, weed is legal and not just legal. The block he lived in Brooklyn, it was a short block and there were three weed stores on his block. In fact, one was on the first floor of below his apartment. So the joke was he could lower a basket out the window with some cash in it and score. But it's really important to know who our kids are and what their real goals and hopes and wants and dreams are, not the hopes and dreams and wants that we have for them, but what their hopes and dreams and goals are, because that's the leverage we have to say, sweetie, you want to be, I don't know, an architect, you want to work on an oil rig, you want to be in the military. There are certain things that are just not going to fly if you want to do those jobs. And like with my son, I said, um, we know that the hippocampuses in kids who use weed on a regular basis are smaller, can be smaller than the hippocampus, which is the seat of memory formation and consolidation. And if you need a really good memory, weed is one of the last things you want to be using because it's just, and especially as an adolescent, because that damage can be not just short term when you're actually using, but long term. That's
yeah.
the big difference we're talking about between the adolescent brain and the adult brain.
Okay. Well, Jessica, you are a wealth of knowledge, and friends, we have been talking to Jessica Lahey about two of her books. The first one is called The Gift of Failure. The second book is called the Addiction Inoculation. Your first book is published by Harper. Is the second book a Harper publication as well?
They are
And
both
Jessica,
Harper. Yep.
they're both Harper. That's great. Her Jessica spells her name Jessica. Last name is Lahey, Lahey, Lahey. These are books which are readily available on Amazon um, and booksellers, I imagine, all over Barnes and Noble, and so you can
Support your
find them.
local independent booksellers. Support your local independent booksellers.
Exactly, and you can, if nothing, if they don't have it in your local independent booksellers, have them order for you rather than going to Amazon, which I know is so easy. I
Yeah, well,
I
and the
hate
other
to.
the other super fun thing is I got to narrate the audiobooks, which is one of my favorite things. I got a job in radio just so I would be prepared to narrate the audiobooks. And if your listeners are interested, there's also at jessicalahey.com under videos. I did around 200 videos on the contents of the addiction inoculation. They're only 90 seconds long each, and around 150 videos on the contents of the gift of failure. So if you just want to watch some short videos, they're all there, indexed on my website.
Wow, wow, that's amazing. You did 200 for the gift, the inoculation. Wow.
They were just
Um,
daily videos. I released one a day on my Instagram reels, and then I just have them all indexed on my website. So you can find them indexed by
Beautiful.
topic.
I'm going to check that out. Okay, well, friends, we have had a great conversation today with Jessica Lahey. She is a driven person. She's done a lot. She has written 2 books, The Gift of Failure and the Addiction Inoculation. What are you going to do next, by the way, Jessica? What's your next project?
Well, I have 2 emerging adults, and I have a lot of questions about how to be the best possible parent for them. So that's what I'm working on now.
Good for you. Okay, well, I look forward to that next book. So and thank you again for being on my podcast today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And friends, thank you guys for tuning in. You have been listening today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. I do encourage you to find Jessica Lahey. She's out there. She's done a lot of good work. So find her and buy her books. And so until next time, be well, be safe. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.